Welcome to the Primetime Podcast. I am Primetime James Thomas coming at you with another video. And the Vince McMahon documentary was released September the 25th on Netflix. A 6-part documentary detailing the entire career of Vincent Kennedy McMahon from his start into the business into his outing 2022. The review for this channel will not be a traditional review where I talk about episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. No. Instead, we're gonna group the subjects, the topics together and do a review of a subject. Subject 1 is the McMahon family. What was in the documentary about the McMahon family? What did we learn about the McMahon family? And what was missing from the McMahon family story? Let's start with what was missing. There was missing members of Vince McMahon's family. For instance, there was no talk of his brother or his sister, which Vince McMahon does have a brother and a sister. His brother passed away at the age of 77, I believe, and I'm not so sure about his sister. There's no conversation whatsoever about them. Vince McMahon also had a stepmother, who I believe was Manita or something like that. That was his father's wife when he met her. There's no conversation about her either. There's very little outside of the talk of abuse about his mother. There's very little to nothing about her as well. So there's a great deal missing in terms of how Vince really feels about other family members. But what you get from the documentary in terms of how Vince's behavior and his thought process is that he seemingly seems to keep everyone, except for one person, at arm's length. And the one person that he seems to really let in is Stephanie. That seems to be the only person that he likes Stephanie. He wants Stephanie around. He wants Stephanie in. But Shane, who I think the documentary leans a lot more towards sympathetic towards Shane, telling Shane's story. Telling Shane's story is important as it shows what kind of father Vince McMahon is. And to be quite honest, I think that's a good place to start. What kind of father was Vince McMahon? We know he wasn't much of a son because he never really met his dad till he was like 12 years old. And he won't talk about his mother. We don't know what kind of brother he was because he won't talk about his brother or his sister. But there is an extensive amount of information in here about what kind of father he was. Well, is. And the sense I got for it was that they wanted to show you, and this is kind of maybe people being defensive, but I kind of want to throw this out there. There was a sense of Vince was manipulating the kids. That he had manipulated Stephanie into being sexy on TV, doing sexual angles and stuff like this. He had manipulated Shane into thinking if he goes out there and throws himself onto the mat and falls from high places, that dad will love you. I kind of got that sense. Maybe nobody else would get that, but that's what I kind of got out of it. The amount of time they spent on Shane was clearly for sympathy. Episode 6 especially was very heavy on the Shane content. They talked about Shane leaving WWE for several years after him and Vince have had a falling out. There's stories in here from Paul Heyman saying that Shane and Vince would get into these arguments. Vince Shane a knife and said, "Stick it right here. That's the only way you're going to get what you want," which was crazy to me. Just showing that Vince is psychotic, right? He really is a crazy person. And this is what Shane had to deal with for a long period of time, that this man is so controlling, so stuck in his ways. There's a story about the UFC in here when UFC was having a financial troubles and Shane wanted to buy the company. and Vince didn't want to buy the company. And then there was this little dig that Vince threw in there when he says, Shane, use your own money. And Shane kind of the editing, the way it's put together is kind of like Shane was proven right in the end because UFC sold for $4 billion just a few years ago, few years later. But Vince said in the documentary, he told the truth. Shane didn't have the money to turn UFC around. And it's a different business model than WWE is doing. I get that you want to have some sympathy for Shane and you want to show that it would have been a good business to take control of, but it's very different from pro wrestling. And Vince knows nothing about mixed martial arts. And Shane knows a little bit, I think, but he didn't have the money. And what people need to realize is too is that when you talk about this deal with UFC, is that the reason why it sold for $4 billion is because of what the Fertitas put into it. And the Fertitas lost money for years and years and years on UFC before it started making a profit. Did Shane have the funds by himself to get in there and do that? That would be the question that I would have asked upon bringing that subject up. But a lot of it was Vince is an old man. He wouldn't get out of the way. Shane is trying to impress his dad, coming to him with business ideas or creative ideas or whatever. And every step, Vince is in the way. He's blocking it. And then we get to the episode 6, in episode 6, which again is very Shane heavy. And you get a sense that Shane was living his life on his own, and then Vince called him to come to make the big return in 2016. Then we get the WrestleMania 32, and all the various wrestlers on Talking Heads are discussing the relationship between Shane and Vince, and how Shane is constantly chasing the big hug. He's constantly looking for affirmation from his dad. And he finally got it at WrestleMania 32 after he took the big bump off the cell. And Vince gave him a hug. And Shane was so emotional about that. But they also did a really good job of just juxtaposing Vince's coldness to Shane's recklessness. Because they showed the footage of Shane backstage with his sons, surprising them, saying, you guys are going to come out there with me. Be in my interest for WrestleMania, which we're so excited about, right? They also show after Shane takes the big bump from the cell, you see Stephanie like being concerned, and Vince doesn't even flinch. He's just watching the screen intently, paying no attention to his own son falling off top of the cell. Those things resonated with me. If you pay attention, they're telling you what kind of father Vince McMahon is, and at least to Shane, at least in relation to Shane. That Shane has put his body on the line for the company multiple times. He came with creative ideas, business ideas, and Vince wanted nothing of it. Wanting nothing to do with it. What was it about Shane? Was he never proud of Shane? Or was he much like his own father? Where you get a sense of Vince himself was never really close with his dad. So he's got that old man distance where guys today would hug and kiss their sons on the forehead and all that stuff. Back then, that was not what you did. Maybe you show your love and affection in a different way. Vince says in the documentary, he's always been proud of Shane, of the things he's accomplished. He said that he always been proud of Shane for the things that Shane has tried. This was this was meaningful, except in some sense it does feel a little bit empty when Vince talks about his father and he talks about his father telling him that he loved him after he became a success. He successfully paid off the company from Vince Senior and Gorilla and all Scotland and all those guys. And now he's starting to compete on a national level. He's going in there, he's mixing it up, and there's a rift between father and son. And the rift is that Vince Senior does not approve of what Vince Jr. is doing, but he's the boss now. And so you get a sense that Vince is expecting Shane to have the same ambition as him. And instead of asking for permission for him to do, he wants Shane to go out and just do it for himself. That's what it feels like to me. And it ties to so closely to what Vince was saying about the UFC. Take your money. Why you have to come to me and say, "Dad, I got this great idea." Rather than you just go do it. Just do it. Is that what he wanted for Shane? He wanted Shane to take the initiative to go out and do something on his own because he ended up leaving eventually. And Shane had nothing to do with the company for almost 10 years. But it seems like Vince is a guy who has problems communicating that kind of thought to his son. It really made him look like a shitty father, to be honest with you. It felt like he was a terrible father, that he was emotionally distant, that he was manipulative. That's how it felt like to me. I don't know if that was the intention, but that's how it felt to me. At least on the subject of Shane, it seemed like he was emotionally distant from Shane. He denied Shane rewards. He, of course, denied him. He denied him the company, which everybody kind of felt should have been Shane's, to run the WWE after Vince was gone. He denied a lot of Shane's ideas, rejected a lot of Shane's ideas. And he seemed to push Shane's buttons. Like doing the storyline with Linda, where he's having these affairs with Linda sitting right there, knowing Shane doesn't like it. There's other little petty thing here that spoke out to me, specifically with Shane, is that Vince Vince is nudging Stephanie towards dating Triple H, and Shane is against it. He's like, no, she can't date one of the boys. How can she date one of the boys? Of course, this becomes a storyline on TV, but Vince says, well, what do you mean, Shane? She can't date a wrestler. Like, what do you think I am? He he was putting himself in the position of a wrestler, saying, and then there's a positive to this too. I'll get to in a second, but it almost came across as he was saying to Shane, "Who are you? Like, we're all wrestlers. You're a wrestler. I'm a wrestler. She's a wrestler. We're all wrestlers." Because we all know that Vince always felt like he was one of the boys. That Vince always felt like he was one of the boys. And Vince probably looked at Shane like, "You think you're better than us?" And that's the sense that came to me when he said the way Shane was against Paul and Stephanie, Triple H and Stephanie, dating, that it was almost as if he was looking at Shane as Shane was judging the boys. And he saw himself as one of the boys. Very awkward to me. because you are the boss. Yeah, you're out there wrestling, but you don't need to. Shane doesn't need to do this. Stephanie didn't need to do this. And maybe Shane was, being a little uppity. Who knows? I'm pretty sure the context of those conversations were a little bit different than what we got from the documentary. But I got a sense of he felt judged by Shane, or at least defensive about what he does and what he was sort of nudging Stephanie on doing. So the Shane part really stuck out to me as being, what kind of father is Vince McMahon? Now, the Stephanie stuff made him look creepy. And that was kind of, I guess, was by design. Stephanie is not featured as much in the documentary as Shane is. In fact, outside of episode 5, there's not a lot of Stephanie at all, actually. So we get a sense that Vince saw a bit of himself in Stephanie. That she was so enamored with him that it doesn't matter what he asked her to do, she would do it. And she was also a Vince pleaser, but in a little different way than Shane. That she put herself in this position to be demeaned, for the crowd to call her slut. And the boys are calling her a slut. The crowd's calling her a slut. That became a running joke in the Attitude Era. For years, Stephanie being called names. I mean, come on. Chris Jericho became famous because of his roasting of Stephanie McMahon. The Rock, Undertaker. Stephanie and Stephanie's in these relationship angles. The camera angles are catching her trying to be sexy. And people are kind of like, is it kind of weird that your father is asking you to do this stuff? You make out with this guy and the camera's on your legs, and you're going up your skirt. I mean, come on, like who doesn't remember that? Who does not remember that SmackDown opening with camera from Stephanie's thighs and panning up to her ass and all that stuff? Stephanie in 2003, peak Stephanie McMahon. But mostly, it felt like he was exploiting and manipulating Stephanie in terms of matchmaking her with Triple H, kind of like nudging that situation into life, making it happen. And of course, that begs the question of, every time they tell the story, there's not a new story. Clearly, this is the story that's been told 100 times already, but it takes on a different context when you're showing him as manipulative and in some ways distant or abusive in one way, shape, or form. It could go from ho 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 ho, I like this guy, to I wouldn't mind you dating my daughter, to you should probably date him. Almost like an arranged marriage of sorts. And that gives it a real weird vibe. And I really considered that as I was sitting and watching and listening to the Stephanie portion of the documentary. So there's the idea that Vince wants the real wedding, to be on pay-per-view. Stephanie says no. So Vince then books himself in a match versus Stephanie on No Mercy 2003 in an I Quit match. Of course, it's positioned as punishment. That she won't do what Vince wants her to do, so he's gonna beat her up in a match, in a storyline. I don't know how true that is. I'm not certain, how that is, how that worked out. But the positioning of the documentary, again, shows that if you reject his ideas or reject his advances in some way, punishment immediately comes. You get a sense that saying no to Vince has consequences. That denying Vince something that he wants has consequences. He tells a story about the baby. What if Stephanie gets pregnant and I'm the father? Which is insane, ridiculous, absurd storyline that is slipped in there. That makes him look like a creep. So they're showing you all these, and look, it is weird. Yes. Why would you even pitch that idea to your daughter? Again, they're trying to come up with outlandish storylines and crazy ideas. Who knows how over that would have gotten, an incest angle. I mean, golly, none of this stuff makes sense. It's the Attitude Era / Ruthless Aggression Era. None of this stuff makes sense. But they made sure that story was told because it involves two things: sex and weirdness. All right, but they didn't. Thankfully, there was not any retaliation for Stephanie saying no to that storyline. The important bit with Stephanie actually comes in later on, episode 6. Now, Stephanie's not in this episode a lot at this point, but they tell the story that as Vince starts to wind down in the 2020s, that Stephanie's role and Triple H's role increases on the product. Triple H is helping on creative. Stephanie is helping more in the office. And that's the setup. Triple H is going to take over creative. Stephanie's going to take over in the office. When Vince gets hammered with the first lawsuit, with the first story, Stephanie becomes CEO. Triple H becomes the head of creative. Then there's this tug of war that happens going into 2022, where the board doesn't want Vince to return. Vince gangstered his way back, and Stephanie immediately quits. She resigned. And this is when I really raise an eyebrow, because you get a sense from the way they put this thing together that Vince resigned because somebody close to him suggested he should. And then a couple of months later, he decided, you know what? I didn't need to resign. I was given bad advice. I'm going to come back. And they're saying, like, who would give Vince this bad idea to resign? Who could that be? And the camera goes right to Stephanie. And I'm like, and it's really weird that once Vince returns, Stephanie leaves. And then I started putting two and two together. The documentary is telling me that Stephanie is involved in this conspiracy to bring Vince down. Or at the very least, I think somebody in the documentary said it, that she doesn't want anything to do with WWE as long as Vince McMahon's there. And I'm like, okay, that's 1 + 1 = 2 to me. But in my own mind, I'm thinking Vince is coming back for the sole purpose of selling the company. He's going to sell the company. And Vince is telling everybody, oh, this is evolution. This is about the growth of the company, blah, 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 all that BS. And I say, is this punishment? Is he selling the company because Stephanie is the one who advising him in these situations? His trusted advisor on the board and all this kind. So you start getting these weird conspiracy theories going in my head. And I'm like, did he plan to sell the company ever? Hell no. He planned on dying in the chair. That's what he really planned on doing. That's obvious. He wanted to work until he didn't wake up the next day. And he was grooming Stephanie to take over. Well, now Stephanie is in the chair, and she quits as soon as he comes back. Seems to me like him selling the company out of the family was Shane can't be trusted. He doesn't have enough ambition. He doesn't have the spine. As Tony Atlas said, Shane's too nice, and Stephanie betrayed me. That's how it came across to me. It came across to me that Vince felt betrayed by Stephanie, so he sold the company. Now, neither one of y'all can have this. Very vindictive. Now, this is not said, of course, but what else could it possibly be? That you sell the company from underneath your own daughter. You didn't need to do that. He didn't need to do that. Why else would you do that? Unless you had a sense that Stephanie was the one behind the whole thing in the first place. Or at the very least, you feel like you can't trust her. The paranoia paranoia can be a terrible thing, y'all. And if somebody's feeling attacked, and this is another thing that we see about Vince and his reactions. When he feels attacked, he gets defensive, he lashes out. He was so happy to sell the company because he got his power back. Screwed Shane and screwed Stephanie. But he got his own thing. And everybody's focused on that thing. And everybody thinking that, oh, he sold the company so he could stay in power. I'm thinking of it now as that's one piece, but it's also perhaps that he sold the company so that Stephanie and Shane couldn't have it. Because he doesn't trust them. And that also makes him look like a shitty parent, a shitty father. That he built up this business that everybody assumed was going to go to Shane and Stephanie. You know, say that maybe they split the positions and they split the positions with Triple H whatsoever. But no, Shane doesn't get to work in the office at all and has not worked with WWE since Vince left, by the way. And Stephanie is out of the company. She only appears as a symbol. And Triple H, I mean, forget about it. He just does creative. When all these people 10 years ago, it looked like they were going to be running the company when Vince clocks out finally. And it didn't happen. So we get a sense that he wasn't much of a son, considering he never met his father, no conversation about his relationship with his mom, and the only thing we know about his childhood is that he was abused by his stepfather. We don't know how he is as a brother. We don't really get a good sense of he was a good dad. Not a great one. Maybe he was good, but not dad of the year. You know, when you're a workaholic like Vince McMahon, family and close relationships, they fall to the wayside, especially as they get older. This brings me to Linda. How was he as a husband? And we get that we see that him and Linda was close, at least at first. They started the company together. They went through the ups and downs together. Linda was the business end of the company. Vince was the creative end. Linda was going to talk to state athletic commissions to get wrestling, to get WWF deregulated to the state. She was handling a lot of the merchandising. Vince was on screen. He was working with the boys. Everything was working out great. And they never discuss like the problems that they had. It's clear that something happened. They did mention the Playboy article from 2001 when Vince talks about having affairs. There is Vince talk about Rita Chatterton, where he mentions, and we'll talk about that later on a different video, that he mentions it was a consensual affair. There's at least one other woman who I believe was a secretary during the steroid trial that Vince was apparently having sex with too. And so Linda was in the documentary, and of course, it talks about her not being good as an on-screen character, which is nice and everything, and how to come up into the storyline. But there was no conversations from Linda's perspective about how she felt about these affairs, assuming these affairs are consensual, of course. And these are just the affairs that we know about, because he's saying Rita Chatterton was just an affair. What did Linda think about that? The documentary, the people, the creators of the documentaries didn't ask her. What did Linda think about the Playboy article? They didn't ask. So you just get the sense that they've been living two separate lives for a really long time. And that part is true. And we got no background on it. They've known each other for 60 years. And there was no conversation whatsoever about why they seem to live two different lives. There's not even a conversation about Linda running for office. That's not even in the documentary. Vince spent almost $100 million on that thing. And there was no conversation about it at all. Or its effect on the business, or its effect on Vince, or its effect on the relationship. All of this is important, because part of the reason why Linda didn't win, on top of the fact she's not very charismatic, obviously, certainly not charismatic to be a politician, but it's because every single commercial was about how sleazy the WWF was, how terrible Vince McMahon is, the Ring Boy scandal, all the things that talked about in these documentaries and everything. Connecticut was inundated with scandals when Linda ran for office. No conversations about how Vince felt about Linda running for office. It was so skeletal, so empty. It took a while to get the relationship, which I was glad to see. You know, his mother introduced them. He was 16, she was 13, and then they got married when Linda turned 17, and Vince was about 20. But other than that, in their rough days in the beginning, there's not much talk of that either. They talk about how they built the business together and how they came up with the first WrestleMania together because Linda forced them to go on vacation. And it seemed like a normal couple. And then no more Linda. Everything after 2000, after they talked about her as an on-screen character, there's no more Linda. No more Linda's thoughts on the IPO and them going public. No Linda's thoughts on various other issues that occurred in WWE that might have involved Vince. No conversation at all about that. None. Zero. Zilch. So you don't really get within the family. You don't really get how Vince felt about the children being born. Usually they do the cold cliche, greatest day of my life was when my son or my daughter was born. The greatest day of my life outside of my kids being born. We don't even get that. There's no humanizing Vince in this when it comes with his family. It's drenched in emotion when it comes with Shane. The documentary is very emotional when it comes to Vince and Shane. It's weird, creepy, and conspiratorial when it comes to Stephanie. When it comes to Linda, it's very little. No love, no happiness, no talk about their honeymoon, none of that. Maybe like one wedding picture between the two. That's it. And like I said, Linda was Vince's day one. She was with Vince when Vince was at the bottom. It seems like he's so distant from the rest of his family. He was distant from his father, distant from his children, distant from his own wife. So when you get to when the question that they're asking in the documentary is who is Vince McMahon, his family doesn't even know. How could they? So I thought the family angle of the documentary was very interesting. But what did you guys think? That is part one of the Vince McMahon breakdown. And expect more in upcoming weeks and upcoming days. Hope you guys have enjoyed this breakdown. But yeah, Vince McMahon. Promoter first, businessman second, family man way in the bottom. This is Primetime James Thomas, and I am out. Peace.